Religion and video games are not words you'll typically find uttered in the same sentence. Even though I intended for this video to be out on Easter Sunday, I am nonetheless daring to be different. Specifically, during this fine spring holiday season, I would like to talk about my favorite game of all time, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Why, you might ask, would I elect to talk about this game when the focus of Easter is to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ, or to enjoy a bunch of candy and colorful egg hunting if you don't ascribe to Christian beliefs? Well, that explanation will come together gradually throughout the course of this video, but I'll start by saying that I should clarify that Breath of the Wild is my favorite game. Does that mean it's the best game of all time? Not exactly. The claim of something being the absolute pinnacle of its art form is just an opinion anyway, and there are so many games out there which appeal to wide ranges of personal taste that to say one single game is the best of them all is a little presumptuous, to say the least. Since first playing it back in early 2018, Link's debut adventure on the Nintendo Switch remains my favorite game of all time for a lot of reasons. The biggest of these, which I never could have expected when I first played it, is that it deeply impacted my spirituality. Now I've really got you curious, haven't I? After all, is Breath of the Wild even a Christian game? Given Japanese demographics, I'm gonna assume a no on that one. There certainly is a possibility that members of Breath of the Wild's development team consisted of some Japanese Christians, but I would tend to believe, especially after having read through this beefcake from cover to cover, that people involved with making key artistic decisions on the game were influenced by other cultural biases. Even with that though, if the developers didn't intend to echo aspects of Christian tradition, the game has a lot of uncanny similarities to the New Testament simply by accident. At least that's how I see things. I'm familiar enough with stories of Christ's ministry in the Holy Land to recognize when comparisons can be drawn to these stories, no matter how arbitrary or superficial those comparisons can be. In this case, specific aspects of Breath of the Wild bear enough similarity to New Testament stories for me that I just couldn't ignore them. Those very things added up to a profound deepening of my spirituality that I never saw coming, which I'd love to share with you as best as I can with the words I write and say. With that, the thoughts I'll share here are partially based on an essay that I wrote on my now inactive personal blog back in April 2018. At that point, I was a little over 3 months into my original playthrough, and the essay was skewed towards my specific beliefs as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Fast forward to today, and I'm currently on my second playthrough with my wife having joined in on the action this time around. You could say that this video is an expansion and refinement of that original essay. Moreover, I've decided to be more general with my religious commentary so that people of little to no biblical background could hopefully follow along with my thoughts. I just happen to have a very personal experience with this game that elevated it above just being an incredibly fun and detailed Zelda title, and my Christian beliefs are a big factor into that. I will also have to provide some background on the New Testament to establish some context for some of my thoughts. And one last thing before I get into the rest of the video. I am going to be divulging some big, major spoilers for Breath of the Wild. If you've never played the game and wish to not have the story spoiled for you, then I'm afraid this isn't the video for you, my friend. But if you have played the game or just don't care, thanks for sticking around. To make the point I eventually will make, I was going to have to talk about Christ's life to some extent. All of what I'm about to share is a quick summary of events from the New Testament in the Bible. The first 4 books of the New Testament, commonly referred to as the Gospels, are different accounts of Jesus Christ's life and ministry written from the perspectives of his disciples. From these 4 books, we learn many aspects about his life from the things he said and did. It all starts with him being born of the Virgin Mary in Bethlehem. Despite being of divine, godly origin, he was born of man in the humblest of circumstances. As he grew older, he came to know and understand the divine mission given to him from on high. That being to set a perfectly righteous example for all people to follow after, and then suffer as a sacrificial lamb for the sins of all who had and ever would live. So around the time when he turned 30 years old, he began his 3-year-long ministry of preaching and performing miracles throughout the Holy Land. Along the way, he also gained followers that stuck with him throughout the duration of that ministry. But in contrast to the following he gained, Jesus actually got a lot of enemies. In particular, there was a sect of academically astute and pious rabbis in Jerusalem known as the Pharisees. I'm oversimplifying things here, but while there were many Pharisees who believed that Jesus was the Messiah that was promised to them centuries before, a great many more felt threatened by him. Due to what Christ taught and did, those who felt the latter were distressed by the possible power vacuum he might create in Jewish hierarchy at the time. These men tried to justify their intent to kill him by claiming that his declarations of divinity were blasphemy, a crime that the law of Moses stated was punishable by death. And thus, in 34 AD, Jesus and his disciples marched into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover on the day that would eventually be referred to as Palm Sunday. On the Thursday of that week, Judas Iscariot, one of Jesus' apostles, betrayed him in exchange for 30 silver coins courtesy of the Sanhedrin, which is essentially a tribunal consisting of the Pharisee rabbis. After an unfair trial that very night and a public hearing with the local Roman government the following Friday morning, Jesus Christ was delivered to the Roman centurions to be executed by crucifixion. He died later that day after willingly succumbing to his fatal wounds. According to the writings in all 4 of the Gospels, though, on Easter Sunday, the Lord was resurrected. He later ascended into heaven after 40 more days of preaching in secret to his followers. In the years that followed Christ's death and resurrection, his apostles continued to preach repentance and deliverance through Christ across the Mediterranean. But over time, those men were hunted down, executed, and many Christians in the area were also persecuted, mainly due to conflicts with the Romans' institutionally pagan beliefs. The Roman Empire controlled Jerusalem and the surrounding area for a few centuries. But eventually, Christianity would be a recognized belief system in Roman territory, to the point where it officially became the state religion in 380 AD with the formation of the Catholic Church. Any study of religion and history will show that for the next 1,000 years or so, the church would be the centerpiece of Western society, although it was often plagued with corruption and was used as justification for backwards state-led decision-making and declarations of war during the Dark Ages. Eventually, the formation of Protestant churches and other reformist and restorationist movements would stray away from the Catholic Church as we get into the latter half of the past millennium, but despite all of that, Christians share a common belief: that Jesus Christ will return again to redeem mankind from their fallen state, purge the world of its filth, and bring about a utopian paradise. Now that all of that has been established, let's get into the background of Breath of the Wild and why it's even worth comparing to the New Testament. Just like with Christian theology and that of other Abrahamic religions, the lore of the Zelda universe all starts with a divine being creating all that exists, or in this case, 3 beings. In the very beginning, 3 goddesses named Din, Furor, and Nehru created the land of Hyrule, the scientific laws that govern it, as well as the races of sentient creatures which inhabit it. The most prominent of these races is the Hylians, who are essentially a cross between humans and Tolkien-esque elves. Their origins go all the way back to the game Skyward Sword, in which their deity Hylia was divinely appointed by the other 3 goddesses to protect them. Eventually, for reasons that are too convoluted for me to get into with this video, Hylia decided to abandon her godlike form and reincarnated as a mortal girl named Zelda, who still retained many of the same magical powers. The Kingdom of Hyrule was soon formed with Zelda and her chosen beloved knight Link as her companion. Over the generations and thousands of years that followed, daughters of the many kings of Hyrule were repeatedly named Zelda after the original reincarnation of Hylia. Moreover, it was said that these royal women continued to genetically inherit the sacred powers of their ancestors. When Hyrule faced their most desperate hours of need, a new hero, incidentally they were also named Link and sometimes shared direct lineage with each other, would rise to defend Hyrule, its people, and Zelda herself from the literal embodiment of evil known as Ganon. This cycle would repeat many times across different games, culminating in the endpoint of the series, Breath of the Wild. In this particular game, we learned that at one point in history, the princess and her hero commissioned the creation of weaponized robots known as Guardians and 4 piloted mechs called Divine Beasts, who would aid them in their efforts to quell an attack by Ganon and his evil, monstrous forces. Those machines laid hidden underground until the contemporary kingdom of Hyrule in the game excavated them in preparation for a prophesied return of Ganon. Around this time, the current Princess Zelda was struggling to awaken the sacred power that had been passed down to her, and her frustration became even more pronounced when a young man named Link rose through the ranks of the royal army, and the king appointed him as Zelda's personal bodyguard. While there was once tension between Link and Zelda, eventually they bonded and even developed some affection toward one another as they worked hard to prepare for Ganon's return. But unexpectedly, on Zelda's 17th birthday, it happened.
This is it then.
Are you sure?
Positive.
It's awake. Ganon.
This was an absolute catastrophe. Ganon appeared without warning, seizing control of the Guardians and the Divine Beasts. The citizens of Hyrule were no match, with the castle utterly being laid to a ruinous waste, countless people dying across the countryside, and the 4 champions tasked with piloting the Divine Beasts also perished in the terrible onslaught. Link valiantly fought to protect Zelda in their efforts to suppress Ganon, but they were defeated, with Link being gravely wounded in the process. At the last minute, when all hope seemed to have been lost, a Guardian found Link and Zelda and took aim at him. Zelda stepped in to defend him, and her power miraculously awakened as she selflessly stepped in to save the knight she loved.
No! Was that the power? Huh? No! Link, get up! You're going to be just fine.
The Guardians may have been stopped, but despite her best efforts, he succumbed to his wounds, leaving her alone in her deep despair. Knowing that she still had a mission to complete though, she ensured that Link would be safely placed into a healing chamber known as the Shrine of Resurrection, where he would ultimately recover after a medically induced coma that lasted for an entire century. Throughout that whole time, Zelda faced Ganon alone and used her divine strength to seal them both away, preventing him from inflicting even further death and destruction upon Hyrule. But her power would not last forever. She knew that one day, Link would need to return and help her redeem their fallen kingdom. The moment when Link finally awakes from his long slumber is where the player's journey begins, and where my spiritual journey with the game began as well. There were multiple moments in my original playthrough where things felt uncanny in their similarities to Christ's life. But to start things out, allow me to talk about one in particular that caused me to have this whole line of thinking in the first place. When you reach the outskirt stable, you can find a woman there named Eliza. If you meet her without acquiring the almighty Master Sword first, she talks about how she wants to meet the legendary hero who wielded it. She tasks you with finding the hero and reporting back to her once you've done so. Naturally, with Link being who he is, she obviously doesn't know that she was already looking at him. If you return to her after claiming the sword though, this becomes one of the dialogue options. There's a story in John 4 where Christ is resting at Jacob's well, and he speaks with a Samaritan woman as she gives him water to drink. To provide context, the Jews and Samaritans didn't exactly get along, so it's socially unusual for them to be speaking to begin with. As their conversation deepens, the two of them say the following words, which were recorded in verses 25 and 26.
I know that Messiah cometh, which is called Christ. And when he is come, he will tell us all things.
I that speak unto thee am he.
As I made pretty clear in my opening statements, I find it very unlikely that Nintendo intended for any of this to be a direct allusion to the Bible. Who knows, maybe the people who translated the original Japanese dialogue into English had something else in mind. But what I do know is that when I came across this moment in the game, I couldn't help but think of that story from John 4. and in a way, it's emblematic of how both Jesus Christ and the Breath of the Wild incarnation of Link came to accept their divinely given destinies. You see, I'm pretty sure Jesus didn't just wake up one day and have an epiphany that he was the literal Son of God. He, like his peers, was a student of the scriptures. Through his own study and prayer, he was able to gain his own conviction of his duty to God. Likewise, the game doesn't begin with Link realizing what his destiny is. In fact, when he finally awakens from his century-long slumber, he is an amnesiac. Link has no idea who or where he is, let alone what everyone expects of him. All he knows, and by extension the player as well, is that there's a big world out there, and you hear voices seemingly hovering above the wind, guiding your every step across the great plateau where you start the game. Once you complete all of the objectives given to you in this small tutorial area, you meet the spirit of the late King of Hyrule, who fills Link in on all the key details of his mysterious past. After all of that, Link is given more objectives to follow in the main quest to save Hyrule, but the player is set free to go in whichever direction they want. He or she can do whatever they dang well please rather than following through in the key objectives. If you want to just run around aimlessly killing monsters, hunting after treasure, experimenting with recipes, or freely exploring the map, you can do so. The world is your oyster in this game, and you can go about progressing through the story however you want to. Heck, you can even head straight to Hyrule Castle and face Ganon right after you finish the tutorial if you want to. When I started playing this game for the first time back in early 2018, that's pretty much what I did. I mean, not the heading straight to the castle part, but I just messed around in the world for hours and hours. I was probably at least 40 to 50 hours into my eventual 200-hour playthrough before I really began to experience what the story had to offer. And I'm glad that things happened this way, because I feel like I experienced what Link would have gone through if he was the one calling the shots instead of the one holding the controller. I'd like to think that even after learning about his hugely important responsibilities, he probably wouldn't have been quick to assume said responsibilities. I would expect him to be overwhelmed, choosing to follow his own path. That certainly falls in line with the game favoring the player's agency more than anything else. But to pivot back to the biblical similarities again, let's look at the story of when Christ wandered in the wilderness for 40 days and nights. During this whole period of time, he was diligently fasting and praying, longing to be closer to God. As fate would have it, Satan appeared to him at the end of his long, painful period of spiritual longing. I can only imagine how great of a struggle it would have been to repel the devil's temptations, even if this is Jesus we're talking about. Although he was the Son of God himself, he was still born into a mortal body and was subject to the temptations inherent thereof. But he withstood Satan's evil influence, setting a strong precedent for how bold and headstrong he would become as he preached across the land. Despite the challenges he faced, Christ remained firm in commitment to the mission given to him. When going through Breath of the Wild, eventually the player has to confront the reality that if they want the full experience of the game, they'll need to take the steps to save Hyrule. Breath of the Wild never deliberately blocks you from any section of the map, so the pace by which you go through the adventure is all up to you. You can spend hours just freely exploring the landscape before advancing the story, if you ever do. That said, the game has some tricks up its sleeve to emotionally convince the player to make those necessary steps. One of the biggest ones is that if you visit Hateno Village, you can unlock the camera function of Link's Sheikah Slate, which is essentially just this world's version of a big smartphone. You can then visit Princess Zelda's old handmaid Impa in Kakariko Village, who shows Link that Zelda had saved 12 pictures onto the Sheikah Slate's photo album. Her suggestion is that you can peruse the game's world, find the locations where the photos were taken, and see if that triggers his memories. And indeed, Link's memories can be brought back each time you visit one of these locations. This creative choice is crucial because just as Link is realizing the importance of his mission, so does the player. The steady, piece-by-piece revelations are given to the player simultaneously as Link is informed of his past. So, the longer you go through the story, the more evident it becomes what Link's destiny is, especially as you visit all of the locations where the dead champions hail from. All of these individuals may be fictional, but in a weird way, I still gained a sense of responsibility over their fate. That's been the case for both of my playthroughs so far. I guess you could say that in the act of understanding the journey Link takes in this game, I've also come to understand the struggles that Christ had. He didn't have great success in building a dedicated following when he walked the earth, given how bold and radical his preachings came across to the Jews and Gentiles at the time. But who can blame them? The children of Abraham were given the promise that their Messiah would come to redeem his people for centuries, but when the man who claimed to be the Messiah came along, that pill probably was hard to swallow. I can only imagine how I would have reacted to his sermons if I gave a listening ear in those days. Likewise, Link not only couldn't recall his past as the divinely appointed hero of Hyrule, it's safe to say that the scattered and sparse pockets of survivors had mixed feelings on the matter. Some lived with hope that the hero would return, but most either couldn't care less, didn't quite have the faith to believe in his return, or were bitter towards his catastrophic defeat, with some even going so far as to blame him for the deaths of the champions and others. As such, a major part of the story is for Link, and again, the player by extension, to prove their worth. The people in the Savior's lifetime had to develop the faith that the man they met could be their long-prophesied Messiah, and today, that faith is fostered through study, prayer, church attendance, so on and so forth. For the people of Hyrule, they had to see that the man claiming to be the long-lost hero actually could prove himself as a hero. That's a goal common among all mythical warriors I know, but given the context of Link's near-death, rehabilitation, and personal journey, it fits in this case. After all, when you first visit Robbie at the ancient tech lab in Akala, you literally have to shed your clothes and prove your identity by showing your scars, so, you know. I recognize that the experience of playing The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is different for everyone. It's such a massive, dynamic, and open-ended adventure that people of all backgrounds will gain unique insights from the digitized quest. You may not even have a profoundly spiritual experience from the game, instead just enjoying the game for what it is, a fun adventure full of secrets to unlock, monsters to fight, and landscapes to explore. But for me, I'm glad for the unexpected yet profound lessons I learned from my journey through Hyrule, as unintentional as those lessons may have been. The last place I ever expected to gain a greater personal comprehension of Jesus Christ was through a video game. Yet here we are. Link's adventure helped contextualize for me what it must have been like for Christ to suffer through all that he did while living in this world, and it made me all the more invested in saving Hyrule as a result. Christ is the light of the world, and by comparison,
Link, you are the light. Our light. That must shine upon Hyrule once again. Now go.
if the Lord suffered an incomprehensible level of pain just so I could be happy, cleansed of my sins, and have a better life after this one, then perhaps I can do better to help others, in the digital world, and more importantly, the real world. And that's it! Thank you so much for listening to me talk about a much different topic that is nonetheless deeply personal to me. I hope my points came across well and that I could help you all learn and feel something. If you liked what you saw and would be interested in seeing more of what I have to offer, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining the notification squadron so that you won't miss out on my future videos. Happy late Easter, everyone!